morning sun cast long shadows across Heathrow Airport as Sergeant Major Thomas Hartwell adjusted his uniform one last time. At 62, his shoulders still carried the proud bearing of a lifetime spent in service to the Crown, the purple and bronze ribbon of the Victoria. Cross gleamed softly on his chest, a testament to courage displayed under enemy fire in Afghanistan. 15 years earlier, Thomas had been looking forward to this flight for months. After 38 years of distinguished service in the Coldstream Guards, he was finally taking his first civilian holiday. His granddaughter Emma had invited him to visit her new home in Edinburgh, and he couldn't wait to see the pride in her eyes when she showed him around her. First apartment, the check-in queue moved slowly, typical for a busy Tuesday morning. Thomas didn't mind the wait. He used the time to people watch, a habit formed during countless hours of ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. Families with excited children heading off on vacation, business travelers typing urgently on their phones, elderly couples helping each other with heavy bags, each person carrying their own story. When Thomas finally reached the counter, the young airline employee barely looked up from her computer screen. Her name tag read Jessica, and she appeared to be having a difficult morning. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well, and her movements were sharp with irritation. "Ticket and passport, please," Jessica said, without lifting her gaze. Thomas handed over his documents with a polite smile. "Good morning. Lovely day for flying, isn't it?" Jessica glanced at the ticket, then at Thomas's passport photo. Her eyes lingered on his uniform, taking in the pristine condition of his dress blues, the perfectly aligned medals, and finally settling on the distinctive cross-shaped medal with its crimson ribbon. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked, pointing at the Victoria Cross with undisguised skepticism. "I beg your pardon?" Thomas replied, genuinely confused by her tone. "This fancy costume you're wearing? Are you going to some sort of dress-up party? Because I need to tell you that passengers can't wear military uniforms unless they're actually serving military personnel." Thomas felt his cheeks flush slightly, but kept his voice steady and respectful. "I assure you, miss, this is my proper dress uniform. I'm a retired sergeant major of the Coldstream Guards, and this is the Victoria Cross, awarded by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 2009. Jessica's expression hardened. She had dealt with difficult passengers all morning. She was in no mood for what she perceived as someone trying to impress her with fake military credentials. In her experience, real military personnel were usually younger and less formal. "Right?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you personally know the king too?" "Listen, sir, I don't know where you got this outfit. But military impersonation is illegal, and wearing fake medals is deeply disrespectful to real veterans." Other passengers in nearby queues began to notice the commotion. Thomas felt dozens of eyes upon him, the familiar weight of public attention that he had experienced countless times during ceremonial duties. But this time, instead of respectful acknowledgement, he sensed curiosity mixed with growing embarrassment. "Miss Jessica," Thomas said quietly, "I understand your concern about military impersonation, and I respect that you take such matters seriously. However, I can provide additional identification if needed. My military service record, my pension documentation." "Save it," Jessica interrupted. "Company policy is clear. We cannot allow passengers to fly in unauthorized military dress. You'll need to change into civilian clothes or purchase new clothing from the airport shops before we can issue your boarding pass." Thomas glanced around the busy terminal. The nearest clothing store was at least a 20-minute walk away, and his flight was scheduled to depart in just over an hour. More importantly, he had packed only his casual clothes and his checked luggage, which was already being processed. "I'm afraid that presents a practical problem," Thomas explained patiently. "My civilian clothes are in my checked luggage, and the shops here don't typically carry clothing in my size. Perhaps we could contact your supervisor to discuss alternatives." Jessica's supervisor, a hurried-looking woman named Margaret, approached after being summoned. She listened to Jessica's explanation with growing impatience, occasionally glancing at her watch and the growing queue of restless passengers. "I'm sorry, but we really can't make exceptions," Margaret said. "If you're wearing military dress, you need proper military travel orders or official documentation. A pension card isn't sufficient proof of current service status. But I'm not claiming current service status, Thomas replied. I'm a retiree, traveling as a civilian passenger. Surely retired military personnel are permitted to wear their dress uniforms for special occasions. Margaret shook her head firmly. Company policy is company policy. We've had problems in the past with people wearing military-style costumes, and we can't make exceptions without proper authorization. The situation was attracting more attention. Several passengers had pulled out their phones, some taking photos, others appearing to record video. Thomas noticed a few people whispering among themselves, pointing in his direction. He felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced years ago when facing enemy fire. But somehow this public humiliation felt worse than physical danger. A middle-aged businessman stepped forward from the queue. Excuse me, but that gentleman is wearing a Victoria Cross. That's not something you can just buy in a costume shop. Perhaps you should reconsider your position? Jessica turned on the man with barely contained frustration. Sir, please return to your place in the queue. This doesn't concern you, and we need to keep the line moving. Thomas raised his hand gently. Thank you for your support, but it's quite all right. I don't wish to cause any further disruption. He turned back to Margaret. What exactly would you need me to do to resolve this situation? You'll need to change out of that uniform, or you won't be flying with us today, Margaret stated flatly. Those are your options. Thomas nodded slowly, his military training keeping his emotions in check despite the growing humiliation. Well then, I suppose I should see about rebooking on a later flight and finding appropriate clothing. As he gathered his documents and prepared to step away from the counter, the businessman who had spoken up earlier approached him discreetly. That's absolutely disgraceful treatment, he whispered. A man with your decorations deserves respect, not this nonsense. Thomas smiled sadly. It's quite all right, sir. Not everyone understands military traditions, and I suppose they're just trying to do their jobs as they understand them. But as Thomas walked away from the check-in counter, his shoulders slightly less straight than before. Neither he nor anyone else in the terminal could have predicted what would happen just 8 minutes later. Thomas walked slowly toward the airport's clothing stores, his mind racing with frustration and disappointment. The weight of public humiliation sat heavily on his shoulders, heavier than any military equipment he had ever carried. Behind him, he could hear the normal bustle of airport activity resuming as travelers moved through the check-in process. He paused at a newsstand to gather his thoughts and check his phone for alternative flight options. The elderly vendor, a Pakistani gentleman named Hassan, who had been working at Heathrow for over 20 years, noticed Thomas's distinctive uniform and approached him respectfully. Excuse me, sir, Hassan said quietly. I couldn't help but notice your Victoria Cross. My father served alongside British forces during partition. He always taught me to recognize and respect such honors. Thomas managed a weak smile. Thank you for saying so. It seems not everyone shares that perspective these days. Hassan's weathered face creased with concern. Is everything all right, sir? You look troubled. Thomas briefly explained his situation, trying to keep any bitterness out of his voice. Hassan listened intently, his expression growing more incredulous with each detail. This is not right, Hassan said firmly. My son works for airport security. He would never treat a decorated veteran this way. Would you like me to make a phone call? That's very kind of you, but I don't want to make a fuss, Thomas replied. I'm sure they're just following their procedures as they understand them. Meanwhile, back at the British Airways check-in area, the atmosphere remained tense. Jessica continued processing passengers. But several travelers had witnessed the earlier exchange and were expressing their displeasure with her handling of the situation. Margaret had returned to her office, hoping the incident would blow over quickly. What neither of them knew was that one of the passengers who had filmed the STO confrontation was Sarah Mitchell, a journalist for The Telegraph who specialized in military affairs. She had immediately recognized the significance of the Victoria Cross and was appalled by what she had witnessed. Within minutes of Thomas leaving the counter, she had uploaded the video to social media with a caption explaining the situation. The video began to circulate rapidly among military veterans groups. Royal watchers and social media users who were outraged by the treatment of the decorated war hero Comments poured in from former servicemen and women sharing their own experiences of discrimination, while others tagged news outlets and even official royal social media accounts at the same time. Completely unknown to anyone in the terminal, King Charles III was making an unscheduled visit to Heathrow Airport. His Majesty had been returning from a private meeting with Commonwealth ambassadors when his flight experienced a minor mechanical issue. Rather than wait at the VIP terminal, the king had decided to use the brief delay to make an impromptu visit to greet airport workers and thank them for their service during the busy travel season. The king's security detail had quietly coordinated with airport management to arrange a brief walkthrough of the main terminal. This type of spontaneous public engagement was becoming a hallmark of Charles's reign. He enjoyed meeting ordinary people going about their daily lives, finding these encounters more meaningful than formal ceremonies. Back in the main terminal, Thomas had found the airport's largest clothing retailer and was standing somewhat bewildered in front of racks of overpriced tourist clothing. Nothing seemed appropriate for a man of his age and dignity, and the prices were outrageous. A simple polo shirt cost more than he typically spent on a week's groceries. Young sales assistant noticed his confusion and approached helpfully. "Can I help you find something, sir?" Thomas explained his situation once again, and the young man, whose name tag identified him as David, listened with growing amazement. "You're kidding me," David said. "They really wouldn't let you fly because of your uniform. But that's a Victoria Cross, isn't it? My grandfather told me about those medals. He was in Korea." "Yes, it is," Thomas confirmed. But the airline staff didn't seem to believe it was genuine. David shook his head in disgust. "That's absolutely mental. Here, let me see what we have in your size." On the house, I'm not charging a war hero for clothes because some airline job's worth doesn't know history. As David searched through the clothing racks, other customers in the store began to take notice. Word spread quickly about the elderly gentleman in the military uniform who had been humiliated by airline staff. Several people approached Thomas to express their support and share their own military family connections. Among these supporters was retired RAF Wing Commander Patricia Wells, who happened to be traveling to Glasgow for her grandson's graduation. She had served for 30 years and immediately recognized the significance of Thomas's decorations. "This is absolutely outrageous," Patricia declared loudly enough for the entire store to hear. "I've never heard of anything so disrespectful in my life. That Victoria Cross represents the highest level of gallantry in the face of enemy fire. The man who wears it is a genuine hero." Her words carried the authority of someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. And soon Thomas found himself surrounded by supportive strangers who were genuinely interested in his story. Someone bought him a cup of tea from the nearby cafe. Another person offered to share their Wi-Fi password so he could rebook his flight. And David was still insisting that any clothing would be complimentary. The warmth of their support began to lift Thomas's spirits. These ordinary travelers understood what the airline staff had not, that his uniform and medals represented something significant and worthy of respect. Their kindness reminded him that the actions of a few individuals didn't reflect the views of the broader public. Unknown to Thomas and his growing group of supporters, the video of his encounter with Jessica was now viral, with thousands of shares and increasingly angry comments. Several prominent military charities had shared the footage, calling for accountability from the airline. The story was beginning to be picked up by news outlets, and reporters were already making calls to British Airways' Public Relations Department. More significantly, the video had been seen by someone on the King's communications team, who immediately recognized both the gravity of the situation and the opportunity it presented. A quick conversation with His Majesty's private secretary confirmed that the King would very much like to meet Sergeant Major Hartwell during his impromptu airport visit, as Thomas tried on a simple navy blazer that David had found for him. He had no idea that his morning was about to take another dramatic turn. The King's security team was already making discreet inquiries about his location, and airport management was beginning to realize that their staff's handling of a decorated war veteran was about to become a very public relations disaster. The next few Minutes would transform what had begun as a humiliating experience into something entirely different, though Thomas remained focused simply on catching a later flight to see his granddaughter, unaware that the most powerful person in the United Kingdom was looking for him. The king's arrival at the main terminal created a subtle but noticeable shift in atmosphere. His security detail moved with practiced efficiency, creating an invisible perimeter while allowing normal airport operations to continue. Airport management scrambled to accommodate the unexpected royal visit, with senior officials appearing seemingly from nowhere to escort His Majesty through the terminal. King Charles walked through the busy concourse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to public appearances. He stopped frequently to chat with travelers, airport workers, and shop employees, asking about their work and thanking them for their service. His genuine interest in people's lives was evident in these impromptu conversations, and word of his presence spread quickly through the terminal. Meanwhile, back at the clothing store, Thomas was finally dressed in civilian clothes, the navy blazer over a white shirt and gray trousers that David had provided. The transformation felt strange after decades of wearing uniform, but he was grateful for the young man's kindness and the support he had received from fellow travelers. "You look very smart." "Sir," Patricia Wells observed approvingly, "though I still think it's a disgrace that you had to change out of your proper uniform." Thomas adjusted the unfamiliar jacket. "It's done now. I should head back and see about rebooking my flight. Emma will be wondering where I am." As Thomas prepared to leave the store, his phone buzzed with a text message from his granddaughter. "Grandpa, someone just sent me a video of you at the airport. Are you okay? The whole internet is talking about what happened." Thomas stared at his phone in confusion. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said to Patricia. "Emma says something about a video and the internet. What does that mean?" Patricia pulled out her own smartphone and quickly searched social media. Within seconds, she found the viral video that Sarah Mitchell had posted. Her face darkened as she watched the confrontation between Thomas and the airline staff. "Oh my word," she breathed. "Look at this. Someone filmed what happened to you, and it's been shared thousands of times. People are absolutely furious about how you were treated." Thomas watched the video with growing amazement. He had never paid much attention to social media, but even he could see the angry comments pouring in from viewers around the world. Military veterans, ordinary citizens, and public figures were all expressing their outrage at his treatment. "I had no idea anyone was filming," Thomas said quietly. "I just wanted to catch my flight." David looked over Patricia's shoulder at the screen. "Mate, you're famous. This has been shared by some really big accounts. Even some celebrities are talking about it." But the young man's excitement was tempered by a more immediate concern. Through the store's large windows, he could see an unusual amount of activity in the main concourse. Security personnel in dark suits were moving through the terminal, and airport staff were positioning themselves at regular intervals along the main walkway. "Psst, something's happening out there," David observed. "Looks like someone important is visiting." At that exact moment, one of the king's security officers approached Hassan at the newsstand where Thomas had stopped earlier. After a brief conversation, Hassan pointed toward the clothing store where Thomas had gone to change. "The gentleman you're looking for went that way about 20 minutes ago," Hassan explained. "He was very upset about how he was treated by the airline. A Victoria Cross holder deserves much better." The security officer thanked Hassan and spoke quietly into his radio. Within minutes, additional personnel were moving discreetly toward the shopping area where Thomas was located, back in the British Airways office area. Margaret was having the worst day of her career. Her phone had been ringing constantly with calls from journalists, and the airline's public relations department was demanding a full explanation of the morning's incident. The video had been seen by millions of people, and the company was facing a growing social media storm. Jessica, meanwhile, had been called into a meeting with senior management. She sat nervously in a conference room while executives discussed damage control strategies. The young woman was beginning to realize that her handling of Thomas's check-in had created a public relations disaster for the airline. "We need to find this gentleman immediately," declared James Morrison, the airline's regional director. "We need to apologize publicly and make this right." A decorated war hero being humiliated by our staff, is exactly the kind of story that destroys company reputations. It's unknown to the airline executives. Making things right with Thomas was about to become a much more significant matter than they could have imagined in the clothing store. Thomas was saying goodbye to his new friends and preparing to return to the airline counter. Patricia had offered to accompany him for moral support, and David insisted on carrying his small carry-on bag. "You shouldn't have to face those people alone after what they put you through," Patricia declared. "I've dealt with enough bureaucrats in my time to know how to handle them." As they walked toward the store's entrance, Thomas noticed increased activity in the terminal. More security personnel were visible, and there seemed to be an unusual number of well-dressed officials moving through the concourse. "Probably some government minister passing through," Patricia observed. "They always travel with ridiculous amounts of security." What none of them realized was that the king's communications team had been monitoring the viral video situation and had briefed His Majesty on the details during his walk through the terminal. King Charles had immediately expressed his desire to meet Thomas personally, both to thank him for his service and to address the shameful treatment he had received. The king's aide had contacted airport security, who quickly located Thomas's position and confirmed his identity through the airline's passenger manifest. A discreet plan was formulated to arrange a meeting without causing additional disruption to airport operations. As Thomas, Patricia, and David emerged from the clothing store into the main concourse, they found themselves walking directly into the path of the king's entourage. The timing was purely coincidental, but the result was about to transform Thomas's difficult morning into one of the most memorable experiences of his life. Airport officials rushed forward to create space, while security personnel formed a protective circle. In the center of this organized activity, King Charles himself stepped forward, his eyes immediately focusing on Thomas with unmistakable recognition and respect. "Sergeant Major Hartwell, I presume," the king said, extending his hand with a warm smile. Thomas stood frozen in complete shock, unable to process what was happening. Patricia gasped audibly. David's mouth fell open as he realized they were face to face with the monarch. The dozens of travelers in the immediate area stopped in their tracks, pulling out phones and cameras as they witnessed this extraordinary encounter unfolding in the middle of Heathrow's busy terminal. Thomas's military training kicked in automatically. Despite his civilian clothes and the surreal nature of the moment, he straightened to attention and offered a crisp salute to his sovereign. The gesture was instinctive after decades of service, and it carried all the dignity and respect that had been stripped away during his encounter with the airline staff just minutes earlier. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his amazement. "I am indeed Thomas Hartwell, though I must say this is quite unexpected." King Charles returned the salute with the precision of someone who understood military protocol, then stepped closer with genuine warmth in his expression. "Sergeant Major, I've just learned about the appalling treatment you received this morning. I wanted to personally apologize on behalf of everyone associated with this airport and to thank you properly for your distinguished service to our country." The king's words carried such sincerity that Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. After the humiliation of the morning, this recognition from the highest authority in the land felt almost overwhelming. "Your Majesty is very kind," Thomas replied. "I'm sure the airline staff were simply following their procedures as they understood them. No harm was done." King Charles shook his head firmly. "No harm? Sergeant Major, you were publicly humiliated while wearing the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration for valor that this nation can bestow. That represents not just an insult to you personally, but to every man and woman who has served with courage and distinction." Patricia and David stood nearby, still struggling to process what they were witnessing. Patricia, despite her own military background, found herself starstruck by the unexpected royal encounter. David kept glancing around to make sure this was really happening and not some elaborate dream. The king's aide stepped forward discreetly and handed Majesty a tablet displaying the viral video. King Charles watched the footage with growing displeasure, his jaw tightening as he observed Thomas's dignified responses to the airline staff's dismissive treatment. "This is absolutely disgraceful," the king said after viewing the video. A man who earned the Victoria Cross in Afghanistan, defending our values and our freedom, treated like a common fraud by people who clearly have no understanding of what that medal represents. Thomas glanced around at the growing crowd of observers, many now filming the royal encounter. Your Majesty, I'm grateful for your concern. I wouldn't want this incident to cause any trouble for the airline staff. They're young people just doing their jobs. The king's expression softened at Thomas's gracious response. Your magnanimity is admirable, Sergeant Major, but some lessons need to be learned here. However, you're quite right that this should be handled properly. King Charles turned to his aide. Please arrange for a meeting with the airline's senior management. I think they need to understand exactly who they've offended today and why this kind of treatment of our veterans is completely unacceptable. Meanwhile, back in the British Airways executive offices, panic was spreading through the management team. Word had reached them that the king himself was in the terminal and had personally met with Thomas Hartwell. The realization that their staff had humiliated a war hero just hours before a royal visit was causing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. James Morrison, the regional director, was frantically trying to coordinate an appropriate response. While fielding increasingly urgent calls from the airline's corporate headquarters, the company's stock price had already begun to decline as news of the incident spread, and social media was filled with calls for boycotts. Get me Jessica and Margaret immediately, Morrison barked to his assistant, and find out exactly where Mr. Hartwell is right now. We need to make this right before this destroys us completely.
Back in the terminal.
King Charles was engaging Thomas in conversation about his military service, asking detailed questions about his time in Afghanistan and the circumstances that led to his Victoria Cross award. The king's knowledge of military affairs was evident, and his questions demonstrated genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Tell me about your granddaughter, the king said, changing to a lighter topic. I understand you were traveling to visit her? Thomas's face brightened considerably. Yes, Your Majesty. Emma just got her first apartment in Edinburgh. She's studying to be a teacher, and she wanted to show me around her new home. I've been looking forward to this visit for months. And instead, you've spent your morning being treated shamefully by airline staff, the king observed. That's simply not acceptable. We need to ensure you make that visit to see Emma. As they spoke, airport security had been working to manage the growing crowd of observers. News of the king's presence had spread throughout the terminal, and hundreds of travelers were trying to catch a glimpse of the royal encounter. Social media was exploding with new photos and videos of Thomas meeting King Charles. Patricia finally found her voice and stepped forward respectfully. Your Majesty, if I may, I'm Wing Commander Patricia Wells. Retired RAF, I witnessed the entire incident this morning, and I can confirm that Sergeant Major Hartwell conducted himself with perfect dignity throughout. The treatment he received was absolutely disgraceful. The king acknowledged Patricia with a respectful nod. Wing Commander, thank you for your service as well, and for supporting the Sergeant Major during his ordeal. It's clear he has many friends here who recognize his worth, even if the airline staff failed to do so. David, still somewhat overwhelmed by the situation, managed to speak up. Your Majesty, sir, I just wanted to say that when I heard what happened to Mr. Hartwell, I couldn't charge him for the clothes. A man with his service record shouldn't have to pay for anything after being treated like that. King Charles smiled at the young man's words. That's very generous of you, young man. What's your name? David Hughes, Your Majesty. I work at the clothing store. Well, David Hughes, you've shown more respect for our veterans today than a major international airline. That speaks very well of your character. The King's communications team was already coordinating with airport management to arrange a more private space for the conversation. Aware that the public nature of the encounter was creating security concerns and disrupting normal airport operations, Sergeant Major, the King said, would you be willing to join me in the VIP lounge? I'd like to continue our conversations somewhere more comfortable, and I have some ideas about how to address this morning's unfortunate incident. Thomas looked uncertain. Your Majesty, I don't want to impose on your time. I know you must have important matters to attend to. Nothing more important than ensuring a decorated veteran is treated with the respect he deserves. The King replied firmly. Besides, I'm quite curious to hear more about your service with the Coldstream Guards. We have much to discuss." As the royal entourage prepared to move toward the VIP area, word was spreading throughout the airport about what had transpired. The story was no longer just about an airline's poor treatment of a veteran. It had become a tale of royal intervention and recognition that would soon make headlines around the world. The VIP lounge at Heathrow was a world away from the busy terminal, where Thomas had endured his morning humiliation. Elegant furnishings, soft lighting, and attentive staff created an atmosphere of refined comfort. As Thomas settled into a leather armchair across from King Charles, he still felt as though he might wake up from an extraordinary dream at any moment. "Now then," the king said, accepting a cup of tea from the lounge staff, "tell me properly about Afghanistan. The citation for your Victoria Cross mentions extraordinary gallantry under fire, but I'd like to hear the story from you personally." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Even after 15 years, discussing the events that led to his decoration remained difficult. "Your Majesty, it was just a matter of doing what needed to be done. My men were in danger, and as their sergeant major, it was my responsibility to get them out safely." "Modesty is admirable, Sergeant Major, but I've read the full citation. You single-handedly held off a Taliban attack for over an hour while coordinating the evacuation of wounded soldiers from an exposed position. That's not simply doing your job. That's exceptional courage under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable." King Charles leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've met many recipients of the Victoria Cross over the years. Every one of them has shown the same humble attitude you're displaying now. But the nation needs to understand what that medal represents, especially in situations like this morning's incident." Meanwhile, in the airline's crisis management center, the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's worst fears. The video of Thomas's encounter with Jessica had now been viewed by millions, and the follow-up footage of his meeting with King Charles was trending worldwide. Major news outlets were running the story as their lead item, and the airline's phone system was overwhelmed with calls from angry customers. Margaret sat in her office, staring at her computer screen in disbelief as she read comment after comment, condemning her decision to support Jessica's handling of Thomas's check-in. Her career in aviation spanned over 20 years, but she had never faced anything approaching this level of public outrage. Jessica was in an even worse state. The young woman had gone from processing routine passenger check-ins to being the focus of international criticism in less than 2 hours. Her supervisor had recommended she'd take immediate leave while the company determined how to respond to the crisis. James Morrison was fielding calls from the airline's board of directors, all demanding explanations for how a simple passenger interaction had become a global public relations disaster. The company's legal team was analyzing potential liability issues, while the marketing department was working frantically on damage control strategies. Sir Morrison's assistant interrupted urgently. "We've just received word that His Majesty's private secretary wants to schedule a meeting. They're requesting the immediate presence of senior management to discuss this morning's incident." Morrison's face went pale. A royal summons was not something any business executive was prepared to handle, especially under these circumstances. Back in the VIP lounge, Thomas was gradually opening up about his military experiences under the king's patient questioning. His Majesty demonstrated remarkable knowledge of military operations in Afghanistan, asking informed questions about tactics, equipment, and the challenges faced by British forces in that complex conflict. "The hardest part wasn't the fighting," Thomas admitted. "It was writing letters to the families when we lost someone. How do you explain to a mother that her 19-year-old son died for something? Meaningful when you're not always sure yourself what we were achieving?" King Charles nodded solemnly. "I've had to write those letters too, in my capacity as Colonel-in-Chief of various regiments. It never gets easier, does it? But the sacrifice of those young men and women, and the courage of veterans like yourself, represents the very best of our national character." The king's aide approached discreetly and whispered something in His Majesty's ear. King Charles nodded and turned back to Thomas. "Sergeant Major, I've just been informed that the airline's senior management is requesting an urgent meeting. They're quite anxious to make amends for this morning's treatment. However, I wanted to ask your preference on how you'd like this matter handled." Thomas considered the question carefully. Your Majesty, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want anyone to lose their jobs over this. The young lady at the check-in counter was just following what she thought were the rules. Perhaps this could be turned into a learning opportunity rather than a punishment. The king smiled at Thomas's response. Once again, you demonstrate the magnanimity that makes you worthy of the decorations you wear. Very well, we'll approach this as an educational matter. But some changes need to be made to prevent this kind of incident from happening again. Meanwhile, Thomas's phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and messages. Emma had been trying to reach him, worried about the videos circulating online. His elderly neighbors in London were calling after seeing him on the news. Former military colleagues were reaching out to offer support and express their outrage at his treatment. Your Majesty, Thomas said, glancing at his phone, my granddaughter has been trying to reach me. She's quite worried about all this publicity. I was supposed to be arriving in Edinburgh about now for a quiet family visit. King Charles considered this information thoughtfully. Tell me about Emma. What kind of young woman is she? Thomas's face lit up with genuine pride. She's brilliant, Your Majesty. Top of her class at university, studying to be a primary school teacher. She's passionate about education and helping children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Emma represents everything good about the next generation. She sounds remarkable, the king agreed, and I imagine she's quite proud of her grandfather's service record. She is, though she worries that I don't talk about it enough. Emma says young people need to understand what veterans went through to protect their freedoms. She's always encouraging me to share my stories. The king's expression became thoughtful. Perhaps this unfortunate incident could serve a larger purpose. The public response to your treatment shows that people do care about our veterans, even if some individuals lack proper understanding. Maybe we can use this attention to highlight the service and sacrifices of all our military personnel. As they spoke, the story was continuing to evolve in the media. Military historians were being interviewed about the significance of the Victoria Cross. Veterans. Organizations were using the incident to highlight broader issues of recognition and respect for former service members. Politicians were making statements about the importance of honoring those who served. The King's communications team was monitoring the media coverage. And reporting that the story had transcended its original context. International news outlets were picking up the story, with headlines ranging from British airline humiliates war hero to King Charles personally intervenes for veteran. It was becoming a symbol of broader issues regarding respect for military service, Your Majesty. Thomas said, checking his phone again. Emma has sent me several messages. She's seen the videos and is quite upset on my behalf. She wants to know if I'm all right and when I'll be arriving. King Charles smiled. Why don't you call her? I'd be happy to speak with her briefly if she'd like. It might reassure her to know that you're being well looked after. Thomas hesitated. That's incredibly generous, Your Majesty, but I wouldn't want to impose. ... Nonsense. A grandfather should be able to reassure his worried granddaughter, and I suspect Emma would appreciate knowing the full story of today's events. With trembling fingers, Thomas dialed Emma's number. She answered on the first ring. Grandpa, are you okay? I've been watching these videos online and I can't believe how those people treated you. The whole university is talking about it. I'm fine, sweetheart, Thomas said gently. Actually, I'm in rather distinguished company at the moment. He looked questioningly at the king, who nodded encouragingly. Emma, I'd like you to meet someone. King Charles took the phone with practiced ease. Hello, Emma. This is Charles. I wanted to personally assure you that your grandfather is being treated with the respect and dignity he deserves. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Emma's voice returned, considerably higher in pitch. Your Majesty? This is really the king? Indeed it is, King Charles replied warmly. Your grandfather's been telling me about your studies and your plans to become a teacher. That's wonderful work, and I understand you're quite accomplished at it. Thank you, Your Majesty. I can't believe this is happening. Grandpa, are you really having tea with the king? Thomas took the phone back, grinning despite himself. I am indeed, love. It's been quite an extraordinary morning. This is insane. Emma exclaimed. Wait until I tell my flatmates. Actually, wait until I tell my professors. My military history lecturer is going to lose his mind when he hears about this. As Thomas continued his conversation with Emma, King Charles was meeting with his senior aide to discuss the broader implications of the morning's events. The aide reported that public sentiment was overwhelmingly supportive of Thomas and critical of the airline, but also that this represented an opportunity to highlight veterans' issues more broadly. We've had inquiries from several veterans' charities about whether this incident could be used to raise awareness about the challenges faced by former service personnel. Many veterans report feeling undervalued or misunderstood by civilian society. King Charles nodded thoughtfully. That's an excellent point. Perhaps we can ensure that some good comes from Sergeant Major Hartwell's unfortunate experience. Meanwhile, the airline's management team had assembled in their executive conference room. Preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most important meeting of their careers, James Morrison had been briefed by the company's legal team about the potential ramifications of the incident, both from a public relations standpoint and in terms of possible discrimination claims. The key message, Morrison told his team, is that we take full responsibility for the failure in training and judgment that led to this incident. We need to demonstrate concrete steps we're taking to ensure this never happens again. Margaret and Jessica sat quietly at the far end of the conference table, both acutely aware that their careers hung in the balance. The company's human resources director had already begun discussing potential disciplinary actions. Though the final decisions would depend on the outcome of the royal meeting, back in the VIP lounge, Thomas had finished his call with Emma and was reflecting on the surreal nature of his day. Your Majesty, when I woke up this morning, I was simply looking forward to a quiet visit with my granddaughter. I never imagined I'd be having tea with the king and discussing military policy. Life has a way of surprising us, King Charles replied. Though I must say, your dignity throughout this ordeal has been exemplary. Many people would have become angry or demanding, but you've maintained your composure and even shown concern for the people who mistreated you. Military training, Your Majesty? We're taught to keep our emotions in check and focus on solutions rather than problems. The King's private secretary approached and informed His Majesty that the airline executives had arrived and were waiting for the meeting. King Charles turned to Thomas. Sergeant Major, I'd like you to be present for this meeting. After all, you're the person who was wronged, and any resolution should involve your input. Your Majesty, I'm not sure I'm the right person for such a meeting. I have no experience with corporate matters. But you have experience with leadership, with honor, and with service, the king replied. Those qualities are exactly what's needed here. Besides, I suspect these executives need to understand exactly who they've offended and why your treatment was so inappropriate. As they prepared to move to the meeting room, Thomas's phone buzzed with another message from Emma. Grandpa, my lecturer says you should ask the king about the new Veterans Recognition Initiative. Apparently it's something he's been working on personally. Thomas showed the message to King Charles, who smiled broadly. Emma sounds like a very well-informed young woman. Yes, we have been developing new programs to better recognize and support our veterans. Perhaps today's incident provides the perfect opportunity to announce some of those initiatives. The meeting with the airline executives was about to begin, and Thomas found himself at the center of what was rapidly becoming a national conversation about respect for military service. What had started as a simple attempt to catch a flight to visit his granddaughter had evolved into something far more significant. As they walked toward the meeting room, King Charles placed a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder. Remember, Sergeant Major, you've faced enemy fire with courage. A room full of nervous airline executives should be considerably less challenging. Thomas straightened his shoulders, drawing on decades of military bearing. Yes, Your Majesty. Though I must admit the Taliban never had quite this much potential to affect stock prices. Laughter echoed down the corridor as they approached what would prove to be a meeting that would reshape not only the airline's policies, but also spark a broader national discussion about how society honors and treats its veterans. The airline executives stood nervously as King Charles entered the meeting room, followed by Thomas, still wearing his civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. James Morrison stepped forward, his face pale with anxiety. Your Majesty, on behalf of British Airways, I want to express our deepest apologies for this morning's completely unacceptable treatment of Sergeant Major Hartwell. We take full responsibility for our staff's failure to recognize and respect his distinguished service. King Charles gestured for everyone to be seated before responding. Mr. Morrison, apologies are a start. But what I'm more interested in hearing is how you plan to ensure this kind of incident never happens again. Sergeant Major Hartwell is not the only veteran who travels on your airline. And if your staff can mistake a Victoria Cross for a costume decoration, there are clearly serious gaps in training and awareness. Thomas sat quietly, still somewhat overwhelmed by the gravity of the meeting. These were powerful people discussing policies that would affect thousands of employees and millions of passengers. All because he had tried to catch a morning flight to Edinburgh. Morrison nodded earnestly. Your Majesty, we've already begun developing a comprehensive response. First, all customer-facing staff will receive immediate training on military decorations and protocols. Second, we're implementing new procedures for handling any situations involving military personnel, active or retired. Third, we're establishing partnerships with veterans organizations to ensure our policies reflect best practices. Those sound like reasonable steps, the king acknowledged. But I'm curious about the human element. What about the staff members directly involved in this morning's incident? Margaret and Jessica exchanged anxious glances. Morrison had prepared for this question, but the answer would determine their futures with the company. Your Majesty, after consultation with Sergeant Major Hartwell, we believe this should be treated as a learning opportunity rather than purely punitive action. The staff members will undergo extensive retraining and will personally apologize to Sergeant Major Hartwell. However, they will also become ambassadors for our new Veterans Awareness Program, sharing their experience to ensure other employees understand the importance of recognizing military service. Thomas spoke up for the first time. Your Majesty, if I may, I'd like to support that approach. The young lady at the check-in counter wasn't acting from malice, just ignorance. If my unfortunate experience can help educate others and prevent similar incidents, then something positive will have come from it. King Charles smiled approvingly at Thomas's response. Once again, Sergeant Major, you demonstrate the grace and wisdom that makes you worthy of the honors you bear. Very well, let's discuss how this incident can serve a broader educational purpose. King's aide then distributed a prepared document outlining new initiatives that the royal household had been developing to better recognize and support veterans. Thomas read through the proposals with growing amazement. Your Majesty, Thomas said, looking up from the document, these programs are extraordinary. Annual recognition ceremonies, enhanced support services, educational partnerships with schools and universities. This goes far beyond addressing my morning's difficulties. That's precisely the point, Sergeant Major. Your treatment today highlighted problems that extend throughout society. Too many people, especially younger generations, have little understanding of military service or the sacrifices made by veterans. We need to change that. Morrison leaned forward eagerly. Your Majesty, British Airways would be honored to participate in these initiatives. We could provide free travel for veterans attending recognition ceremonies, sponsor educational programs, and implement these new training protocols across our entire operation. That's a generous offer, King Charles replied. But I want to ensure these aren't just empty gestures designed to repair your public image. The commitment needs to be genuine and long-term. As the meeting continued, Thomas found his phone buzzing constantly with messages and calls. Word had spread that he was meeting with both the king and airline executives, and media requests were pouring in. His simple trip to visit Emma had transformed him into an unexpected spokesperson for veterans issues. Sergeant Major, the king said, noticing Thomas's obvious discomfort with the attention. I understand this level of publicity wasn't what you were seeking. However, your story has clearly resonated with people. Perhaps we could use this opportunity to launch the new veterans initiatives with you as a featured participant? Thomas looked uncertain. Your Majesty, I'm not sure I'm the right person to represent all veterans. My experiences were specific to my service, and I wouldn't want to overshadow the contributions of others. That humility is exactly why you're the right person, King Charles responded. Veterans need representatives who understand service and sacrifice, not publicity seekers looking for personal gain. The meeting concluded with concrete agreements from the airline to implement comprehensive changes, financial support for veterans programs, and a public ceremony where King Charles would formally launch the new recognition initiatives with Thomas as the keynote participant. As the executives prepared to leave, Jessica approached Thomas hesitantly. The young woman had been crying and her voice shook as she spoke. "Sir, I wanted to personally apologize for how I treated you this morning. I had no understanding of what your medal meant, or what you had done to earn it. I'm deeply sorry for my ignorance and disrespect." Thomas stood and offered her his hand. "Young lady, you've apologized with sincerity, and that means a great deal. Use this experience to learn and grow. That's all any of us can do when we make mistakes." Jessica shook his hand gratefully, tears flowing freely. "Thank you, sir. I promise I'll never forget this lesson." After the airline officials departed, King Charles and Thomas remained in the meeting room for a few final minutes of conversation. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, "I need to ask about my original purpose for traveling today. Emma is still waiting for me in Edinburgh, and I don't want to disappoint her after all this." King Charles smiled. "Sergeant Major, I think we could arrange something rather special for your visit with Emma. How would she feel about meeting the king personally when we announce these new veterans initiatives next week?" Thomas's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, she would be absolutely thrilled, though I suspect her university friends won't believe any of this actually happened." "Oh, I think we can provide sufficient evidence," the king replied with amusement. "Now, let's get you to Edinburgh. I believe the airline owes you a first-class flight, and I'd like to ensure you arrive in appropriate style." 2 hours later, Thomas was finally airborne, sitting in first class and wearing his original dress uniform, which had been respectfully returned by airline staff. His Victoria Cross gleamed on his chest as he looked out the window at the countryside below. His phone contained dozens of interview requests, invitations to speak at events, and messages from veterans around the world who had shared their own experiences of being misunderstood or undervalued. What had begun as personal humiliation had become a catalyst for national conversation about respect for military service. When Thomas's flight landed in Edinburgh, Emma was waiting at the gate with tears in her eyes and a huge smile on her face. The grandfather who had left London that morning as a private citizen trying to catch a routine flight had arrived as a national figure whose dignity and grace under pressure had touched millions of people. "Grandpa," Emma said, hugging him tightly, "you've started something really important today. People are talking about veterans' rights and recognition all over social media. You've given a voice to so many people who felt forgotten." Thomas held his granddaughter close, reflecting on the extraordinary day that had transformed a simple journey into something far more meaningful. "Emma, love, I just tried to catch a flight to see you. Everything else that happened was quite beyond my expectations." "That's what makes it so powerful," Emma replied. "You showed people what dignity and honor looked like, even when you were being treated badly. That's the kind of lesson they don't teach in textbooks." As they walked through Edinburgh Airport together, Thomas realized that his morning's ordeal had indeed served a purpose far greater than his personal discomfort. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with quiet dignity and unwavering principle. The story of Sergeant Major Thomas Hartwell and his Victoria Cross would continue to inspire discussions about respect, service, and the values that define a society long after the news cycle moved on to other topics. And in 1 week's time, he would stand beside King Charles to launch initiatives that would benefit veterans throughout the United Kingdom, all because he had maintained his dignity when others failed to recognize his worth.